Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this important discussion. My name is Dalia Mogahed, and I direct research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. For any of you who might not be familiar with our organization, we are a Washington, D.C. and Detroit-based think tank focused on the Muslim American community. We do applied research. That means research not just for research's sake, but research for the purpose of finding solutions and implementable recommendations. It's especially a real pleasure to welcome you today because we are co-sponsoring this important event with the Alwaleed Center for Christian-Muslim Understanding. And in a minute, I would like the Associate Director, Dr. Jack Brown, to come up and welcome you as well. Before that, I'd like to thank a few of our supporters. Some of them are in the audience today. First, Proteus, the Proteus Fund, for their generous support, and Shireen Zaman, I'd like to recognize her in the audience. The Kellogg Foundation, as well as individual donors. And before introducing our first speaker, I'd like to have Dr. Brown welcome you from the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to Georgetown University. The Alwaleed Bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding is a huge supporter of this kind of work, and more of our events involve issues of civil liberties, Islamophobia, bigotry, persecution, whether in the United States or abroad. And I think that the reason, sometimes people say, well, universities, I thought universities just teach classes and it's all about knowledge and it's not about, why is this almost activist role part of university life? I think it's because universities have always been based on the idea that knowledge is an essential component for peace and concord. So bigotry, hatred, persecution, discrimination, these things often originate from ignorance, and then they perpetuate ignorance. So people are ignorant, they hate, they disdain, and then they don't see the point in learning about the other, this person or this group that they have disdain and ignorance of. So knowledge is an important tool for preventing bigotry and preventing discrimination. Second of all, one of the key means by which understanding can be promoted, whether between the West and the Muslim world, between Muslims and Christians, is by acknowledging or agreeing on a shared infrastructure, a shared system of rights, of respect, of governance. And so it's very important to promote ideas like the rule of law, ideas like the rights that Americans are supposed to enjoy, ideas that the rights that all human beings are supposed to enjoy. This is an important means for promoting understanding as well. So Islamophobia is really, I think, represents the challenge of discrimination in the United States today, both in that it stems from ignorance, it promotes ignorance. All you have to see is the examples of how, just in Maryland this last week, a school, one school that had put a lesson about Islam in the curriculum started receiving attacks from parents who didn't want their children learning about this, what they perceived as evil religion. So you can see that the bias against Islam and Muslims is preventing people from learning about Islam and Muslims, which could then prevent or ameliorate that bias. Second of all, you see very clearly right now in the United States how Islamophobia is used to deprive a group of Americans, Muslims, of their rights, the rights that all American citizens are supposed to enjoy. And it's used to prevent them from trying to access those rights. So I think that this event is, if you know, in the description of the event and the speakers, they've really identified a nexus between bigotry, ignorance, discrimination, and the challenge and the threat that prevents the rule of law and to rights in this country. And that's really, you know, Americans are used to thinking that there's something special about their country. If they don't preserve the regime of rights, constitutional rights that in this country, they will not have anything special, you know, in a generation or two. So this is absolutely crucial for Americans to preserve. And I'm very happy to see organizations like this one and other Muslim organizations doing their part in that and helping to lead this struggle. And the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding is absolutely delighted to play its role as well. So I hope that you'll enjoy these speakers. I hope that there'll be lively discussion. And without further ado, I'll let the first panel begin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I'll be moderating this discussion this afternoon. Very excited about the topic because what this study will show, as in a few minutes, is how the whole idea of anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia is far from simply a Muslim problem. I think what's really special about this study is it puts data around the idea that many people have had for a long time, which is that injustice to one is really a threat to all. I'd like to introduce our first speaker who will be explaining the study. This is the public release of this work, something that the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding has been conducting research on for 3 years. We're very excited for the culmination of this work. And Dr. Saeed Khan has been leading much of this research. He is an ISPU research fellow and co-principal investigator of the research initiative, Islamophobia, a Threat to All. He is in the Department of History and lecturer in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, Michigan, and a research fellow at Wayne State University's Center for the Study of Citizenship. He is also adjunct professor in in Islamic Studies at the University of Detroit Mercy and at Rochester College. He co-teaches a course on Muslim Christian diversity. Following this exciting research presentation, we will have a panel discussion with a group of thought leaders that I'll introduce after the presentation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you, Jack, for the very warm introduction. And thank you all for spending this part of the afternoon with us. It's a very humbling experience, as Dalia said, to come to the point of culmination of several years of research, as well as the culmination of the cooperation and collaboration of many people to reify this particular project. A little bit of background regarding the project itself and how it came to be. Some of you are probably familiar with, in August of 2010, a Time magazine cover story which posed the question, is America Islamophobic? And this article was within the midst of several different events occurring. One, of course, being the controversy swirling around the Park 51 so-called Ground Zero Mosque in New York City, the impending arrival of Pastor Terry Jones from Florida to Detroit in order to ignite the public debate, quite literally, with the burning of Qur'ans, as well as the approaching midterm elections of 2010. And the question then became, was Islamophobia an isolated phenomenon, or was it part of a broader national process? Thank you. Which was underway in the country. Fast forward to November of 2012, and on election night, with the re-election of President Barack Obama, the following quotes were part of the national discourse as the election returns were coming in. And we see that this word of demographics, and particularly making allusions to various groups based on their ethnicity or their race, was part of the conversation, part of the debate of that evening. And within that, and implicit within that, was an acknowledgement that the country was changing. And for some, it seemed as though it was a lamentable trajectory by which the country was changing. This then comes into the idea of whether you like 2050, or as some estimates now place it at 2043, that the United States is going through a demographic shift, at which point in history, and in the history of this country, it will become, for the first time, a majority-minority country. And of course, the implications of this demographic shift are manifold in the areas of the political, the socioeconomic, the cultural, and perhaps even more importantly, the intangible perceptional shift in the way that people see this country, see the direction of this country, and what are the reactions and the responses to this shift when it comes to evoking, for some, a moral panic that America is irreversibly changing course in its own identity, and what does that mean for its position, for its stability, and for its security. Some of the statements that we just presented demonstrate that not only is there an awareness of the demographic shift, but that there is an awareness of the demographic shift, particularly among some politicians, some individuals in the media, and various other opinion makers. So the task at hand then was to try to locate Islamophobia within this broader demographic shift. In essence, trying to, in academic terms, find the situationality of Islamophobia. Was it existing as a unique, isolated phenomenon, or was it part of this moral panic? And instead of focusing on federal legislation, and with all due respect to people inside the Beltway, looking then at a different perspective, one that involved an analysis at the state level of legislative action, and at the same time identifying various pieces of legislation which affected or seemingly targeted groups that were going to be part of this collective of the majority-minority population as it approaches the year 2043. So it was a matter of taking a look at statistics which now seem to be occurring at almost a breakneck frequency. The 2010 census showed that for the first time in American history, the number of non-white, non-Hispanic births was outpacing that of white births. The Pew Center study on religious life in America in 2012 showed that for the first time in American history, this country was no longer a majority Protestant nation. Well, again, these have certain, and for some people, profound implications about their own identity and their own security, about feeling as American, or whatever that perhaps means. What does it mean to the majority power that is then going to slowly become the minority power, ostensibly, in this country? So again, the objectives of this report and the study behind it were to locate Islamophobia within this context, to examine the legislative agenda not from the federal level but from the state level, to illustrate then from this takeaways that would raise the awareness for both Muslim Americans as well as some of these other affected groups at this cross-pollinated, overlapped phenomenon that we hypothesized. And the methodology that we used was to identify 6 areas that were part of the public debate in a very amplified way over the last few years. One was the debate over voter rights, voter access, the debates dealing with voter identification. Another, of course, was immigration, this time at the state level, case in point, Arizona's SB 1070. Reproductive rights access, reproductive health care rights access. The debate swirling at the state level around same-sex marriage after the debates that were occurring in Washington regarding the Defense of Marriage Act. Coming from Michigan, one of the very fecund debates was on the issue of collective bargaining and right to work, so examining labor unions and what was the legislative agenda that was affecting them. And then lastly, looking at anti-Sharia or so-called anti-foreign law legislation. So in each of these 6 areas, we find that there are different groups, some overlapping, that were going to be affected. According to the public debates, voter ID laws were seeming to have a disproportionate impact on minority communities, African American, Hispanic American, Arab American, just to name a few. Immigration issues, of course, being self-evident. Abortion rights access, of course, being self-evident on the issue of gender. Same-sex marriage, of course, affecting the LGBTIQ community. Right to work legislation affecting labor unions, and then finally, of course, anti-Sharia legislation affecting Muslim American communities. And taking a look at this on a 50-state level with a time frame of somewhere between 2011 and 2013, we were examining bills that were sponsored, co-sponsored, proposed, seeing if they died in committee, seeing if they came up for a vote, if that vote failed, or if in fact that vote passed and these bills were enacted into law. And some of the key findings that all of this research then demonstrated were things that for some might seem to be of no great surprise. For others, they seem to yield quite profound new information. And of course, the purpose of the study wasn't necessarily to provide a wow factor one way or the other. It was simply to go ahead and chronicle what the data, in fact, demonstrated. One of these findings was that so-called red states, or those states which tended to be dominated by Republicans, and more specifically states that had a so-called monopoly of one political party, i.e. that the governor and the legislatures were both dominated by Republicans, had the most restrictive legislative agenda in these 6 respective areas. But it also showed that among this group of a specific political party, as the data demonstrated, that it was actually a very small portion of legislators of that political party that were responsible for the lion's share of this legislation, presenting then the phenomenon of what we call overlap legislators, those who were involved in supporting one or more legislative agendas in these different categories. Out of roughly 3,800 Republican state legislators nationwide, it was shown that only 630, about 16.5%, had sponsored or co-sponsored an anti-Sharia, anti-foreign law bill, depending on how it was framed at that particular legislative forum. The data also showed that 80% of the 102 anti-Sharia bills which were proposed within this 3-year period had at least one overlap legislator, the highest of all 6 issue areas. And interestingly enough, the greatest level of overlap was not between anti-Sharia, anti-foreign law legislation and immigration legislation, which was something that many speculated upon as the research was developing. But in fact, the correlation seemed to be between anti-Sharia legislation and strict voter identification laws. It's never a lecture unless you have an AV issue, is it? I feel like I'm at home. That the correlation was of cross-pollination between anti-Sharia and voter ID laws, as well as right-to-work laws. So one of the inferences that was drawn by researchers was that there seemed to be a correlation based on the disenfranchisement and the recession of individuals and entire groups from public sphere engagement. One of the facilitating examples in the study was what we called the curious case of North Carolina, where HB 695 last year the Family, Faith, and Freedom Protection Act, was initially promoted as an anti-Sharia bill to prevent ostensibly the implementation of Islamic law in North Carolina, preventing state judges from considering foreign law, including Sharia, in family court proceedings. But at the 11th hour, there was a piggyback legislation that was added to this bill, which restricted access to reproductive health. So in this sense, we find an actual concrete example whereby legislation from two different issue areas was combined. Call it an act of legislative laxity, call it an act of legislative expediency, call it an act of opportunism because there was a conceit that people wouldn't challenge or protest or oppose in North Carolina very vociferously the anti-Sharia bill. This then provided fair cover for the anti-abortion bill to pass relatively easily over there. Again, it seemed to then affirm the notion of overlap and a certain cross-pollination and integration, if you will, among these 6 areas. Well, the implementation, as well as the implications of this report, are equally manifold. It demonstrates, first of all, that Islamophobia is not really an isolated or unique phenomenon, either historically or even within the contemporary context, which, of course, again, defies how even many Muslim Americans might perceive it. Rather, it seems as though it is part and parcel of a broader phenomenon occurring in the United States, which seems tied to this idea as the country marches toward, and some might even contend slouches toward, 2043 and the ramifications of the country's identity changing forthwith. Muslims are then part of a changing America rather than necessarily seen as an invading force. And despite the fact that the rhetoric around Sharia and anti-Sharia legislation seems to be so otherizing, the measures that are being taken to place a firewall against anti-Sharia legislation seems to also be then within the same metrics, the same tactics, and the same strategy as that which is affecting other communities. For the Muslim American population, of course, this then allows for an increased self-awareness and education, not only about the situationality of Islamophobia within this broader political and legislative landscape, but it also demonstrates then an opportunity to gain greater education about these other 5 issue areas and the correlations and integrations therein. It also allows then Muslim Americans to take a step back and reassess the political context, perhaps in a way become more engaged along a broader category of issues than ones that are necessarily badged as quote-unquote Muslim, explicitly. It also demonstrates and provides a clarion call for exploring the potential intersections with other issues, as well as the ability to then collaborate across issue lines with other interested groups. After all, it also demonstrates that, contrary to popular opinion or perception, the number of individuals or the percentage of individuals involved in exercising an agenda which is affecting them directly through anti-Sharia laws is relatively small. For the broader American population, this report is intended then to develop and gain a contextual understanding of how Muslim demographics and related issues correlate to many of the broader public debates that are and will continue to be in the engagement and conversation of many in this country. For them, they can recognize that potential organizations and communities that have experienced similar strategies of targeted legislation then allows for and augurs moments and nodes of collaboration and cooperation. It identifies and integrates the Muslim impact component of wider legislative and policy concerns. And again, just as it does for the Muslim American community, it locates and engages with existing and emerging pockets of Muslim power across the country. So where Muslim communities are either disaffected or targeted in this way, or at the very least if there's a perception of this, there is then a structure and a landscape which is being created by this kind of data. What we find then is that another key component of this data and its accessibility for the general public is through ISPU's website and at www.ispu.org. And the credit goes to both Hassan Jibril and to Alejandro Butel for creating a rather incredible data visualization. We find then a data visualization map on the homepage of this study, along with each of the reports that are concomitant to the study, which then demonstrates how the legislative record on a state-by-state level can be accessed, can be assessed, can be analyzed, and can be interpreted by anyone who so chooses. So we have here, for example, and forgive me for having a very light finger on an IBM ThinkPad, we find, for example, that if one wanted to isolate a particular year like 2011, and even a particular issue, for example, taking a look at right to vote, one can then go ahead and see on a state-by-state level and on a politician-by-politician level the voting record of those people who sponsored, co-sponsored, or played a very active and central role in that piece of legislation. And then also the ability to examine the status of said piece of legislation, whether it was now dead on arrival after a committee, if it was still pending in the respective legislative house, or if it in fact has passed and has been enacted. So this ability then to map these various areas of legislative content will hopefully provide some tangible and empirical data for those who are interested in, at the very least, seeing what is the current situation in these various areas and issue groups, and perhaps also be able to track a trajectory as the country moves toward its eventual status or restatus of being a majority-minority country. Thank you.
I'd like to ask our panel to now join us on stage as I introduce each of you. Now, to help us discuss the implications of this research, we've assembled a diverse panel of thought leaders. Starting at the very end, is Ms. Madiha Al-Hussein, who serves as a staff attorney at Muslim Advocates and plays an essential role as a member of their legal team focusing on anti-Muslim hate issues. Ms. Al-Hussein joined Muslim Advocates as a legal fellow in 2012. Ms. Al-Hussein was a recipient of summer public interest fellowships from both the South Asian Bar Association of Northern California and the Hastings Public Interest Law Foundation, which allowed her to pursue her interests in civil rights work. She interned with the U.S. District Court Judge Edward Chen of the Northern District of California, the Asian Law Caucus, and the ACLU of Southern California. Our next panelist is Dr. Joseph A. McCartan, who is a historian of the U.S. labor movement and 20th century U.S. social and political history. He is a professor here at Georgetown of history, where he's taught since 1999. His research focuses on the intersection of labor, organization, politics, and public policy. His first book, Labor's Great War, The Struggle for Industrial Democracy and the Origins of Modern American Labor Relations, won the 1999 Philip Taft Labor History Book Award. His current research explores the impact of public sector labor organizations on politics, government, and private sector labor relations. He is also a member of the steering committee of Catholic Scholars of Worker Justice, the editorial committee of Labor Studies in Working Class History of the Americas, and the board of the Interfaith Worker Justice. And last but not least is Ms. Ajenai Clemmons, who serves as policy director for the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit that operates as a national network and research clearinghouse for approximately 650 African-American state legislators across the country and the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is a group that is focused on educating legislators. Prior to her work at NBCSL, Ajenai helped establish a new government agency within the city and country of Denver. She served as community relations ombudsman, in the Office of the Independent Monitor, which monitors internal affairs investigations in the Denver Police and Sheriff's Department. As liaison between Denver's law enforcement and the public at large, she handled citizen complaints, conducted community outreach, facilitated televised public meetings, as well as created and managed one of the largest citizen police mediation programs in the country, whose experience I think will be very important this afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to pose a question to our discussants first off, and I'd let you address it. We've just heard the what of the research, all the overlaps, the state-by-state laws that have this cross-pollination between anti-Muslim and legislation that affects the rights of other groups. How does this impact your work? What are the implications for you in your work of this research that we just heard about? Thank you. Yes. We'll go ahead and start with Ms. Ajenai. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me now? All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Mogahed. And I also would like to say, first of all, good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here having this incredibly important conversation. And I also would like to thank ISPU, the Alwaleed Bin Talal Center, and Alejandro Butel for the invitation. So what does this mean for us at NBCSL, responsible for educating African-American state legislators, about 675 across the country, DC, the Virgin Islands, about a range of policy issues, primarily looking through the lens of disadvantaged communities. I'll say for Dr. Saeed Khan, we are incredibly grateful for, and the entire research team, for the work that you have done. This is seminal, and I have to say, as ominous and sort of conspiracy theory as this all sounds, the report inspires great hope for us, and hopefully for the rest of the country. One, it is deeply reaffirming to our experience, much like learning about structural racism would be. Things that you have always deeply felt and believed now have name, and also it lends a scientific credence to something that we intuitively knew all along. The other piece is that it really provides a framework where concepts that might have been abstract or difficult to articulate crisply or convincingly, now we can do that. And then, but above all, this report means that we are not crazy. Thanks. And not only can we prove what we are feeling, but we have a rational, compelling way to communicate these views. So thank you to Dr. Khan and the entire research team. I want to share just a couple of quotes with you, illustrating the attitudes underlying this comprehensive strategy that Dr. Khan talked about, to take America back to the way that it used to be, rather than adjusting to these demographic shifts and embracing them. So, as we saw legislation ostensibly combating voter fraud gain traction after 2008, we were fortunate to record some of those glimpses of candor on the part of our opponents. So when New Hampshire targeted out-of-state students, for example, from college students from voting, the House Speaker issued a very reasonable sounding public statement that said same-day registration coupled with a lax definition of residency creates an environment in which people may be claiming residency in multiple locations. But then, at a town hall meeting, he says average taxpayers in college towns are having their votes diluted or completely canceled by those of a huge, largely monolithic demographic group composed of people with a dearth of experience and a plethora of the easy self-confidence that only ignorance and inexperience can produce. In the US Supreme Court case, Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, and this happened in 2008, the court voted to uphold the state of Indiana's voter ID requirements as constitutional and not unduly burdensome, even though they could not find a single solitary case of voter fraud. And I'm not joking about this, unfortunately. And so, in the majority opinion, the court cited an example from the 1800s. Tammany Hall in New York City, expressing that the states had a valid interest in deterring or preventing voter fraud. The court also speculated that perhaps they could not find evidence of an actual problem because the offenders were so hard to catch. I'll let that sink in for a moment. So NBCSL's work. I want to just tie, as briefly as I can, ISPU's legislative report to the one that we conducted at NBCSL and released earlier this year. By pure coincidence, we analyzed 2011 to 2013 legislative sessions as well, and to capture how Black legislators were responding to these intensifying efforts to suppress the vote. And so what we found were that there were 601 pieces of legislation in 40 states, plus the District of Columbia, introduced by our members to either protect and or expand voting rights. So since during this time period, Black legislators served in all states except Utah, North and South Dakota, and Montana. That meant that in 89% of all states with at least one Black legislator, Black legislators either sponsored or co-sponsored protective or expansive voter rights legislation. The 5 main categories there were combating voter ID laws. And there we had 64 bills in 17 states. Modernizing voter registration systems and increasing opportunities to vote. That was 300 bills, sponsored or co-sponsored across 36 states. Felony reenfranchisement, 100 bills in 20 states. Adoption of 21st century technology, voter technology, 25 bills in 14 states. Fair and transparent redistricting, 12 states, 18 bills, and then we had a kind of a catch-all additional tools of empowerment, 26 states and 64 bills. So I say all that to say that I'm positive that what our legislators fought for benefited Muslim communities in many instances, in most instances, probably the vast majority of instances. But this goes to show how important it is for all of our communities to collaborate. It is easy to imagine scenarios in which some of our legislators might not have been aware and privy to the challenges that many of your communities face, and the ability to make their policies that much more inclusive and expansive. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this panel, and I'm grateful to have an opportunity to join my colleague Ajenai Clemmons in commending this very, very important report by Saeed Khan that you've just heard summarized. I can't emphasize how important I believe this report is. It's important, I think, first for its timing, and receiving it right now, especially after the political events of the past week or so, I think is very important embracing. I think we're in need now to think in very long-term ways about the kind of power struggle that's going on in this country right now, and I think that this report directs us to that. So it's important, I think, for its timing. I think it's also important for its contents. It's important because it shows a clear connection between Islamophobic policies and other kinds of regressive policies, and particularly those that have to do with questions of power, as Saeed pointed out. questions of access to the ballot, questions of power in the workplace. And I'll return to that in a second. But by directing us to these questions of power in its conclusions, I think it's very important. And also it makes the point in its contents that the kind of attack that's being advanced now, not just against Sharia law, but against people's right to vote, against people's right to form unions, is a carefully orchestrated attack. To me, it's quite significant that only 16% of the legislators that Saeed has investigated and Republican legislators in red states have really been involved in this. This is a minority movement within a party, in part. And it's important to remember that because I think it gives us the sense that this can be fought. This can be fought successfully as long as we understand the nature of this movement and what its ultimate goals are. And I think this report is also important for the challenge it contains within it for us. And that is, I think it demands of us working together, as Ajenai has just said. It tells us that we cannot reverse, anti-labor laws simply by labor trying to act on its own, that we cannot fight Islamophobic laws by those who would identify with the Islamic community standing alone. We have to stand together if we are to turn this back. Now, just a few words about the importance of the finding that Islamophobic legislative efforts are most clearly identified with and connected to efforts to restrict the ballot and to restrict workers' power in the workplace. This is very important. It's not surprising. If you know anything about the history of the United States, it is not surprising at all to find that questions of othering of groups are tied to questions of power in the voting booth and power in the workplace. That was true 150 or more years ago when America's first white ethnic group arrived in this country, Irish Catholics. They were digging the canal that runs along the Potomac below this campus in the 1830s, and they began to organize and to demand improvements in their conditions, suffering from malaria, often not even paid for months on end. They were the first group that had the army called out to suppress a workers' action. At the very same time that they were engaged in that effort, they were also being demonized religiously. Just as the canal workers were involved in that struggle up in Boston, a convent of nuns, the Ursuline convent, was burned down by anti-Catholics who had read the equivalent of a lot of the kind of hate literature that exists now about Islam, the awful disclosures of Maria Monk, supposedly a story of sexual debauchery that was going on inside of Catholic convents that triggered a kind of mass hysteria. So the organization of the Irish along the canal and their very presence in the polity of this country constituted a kind of danger. In the 1890s, when segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans took place, that was also connected to efforts to organize that were underway in the 1880s and 1890s through the People's Party, or the Populist Party as it was called, and the Knights of Labor, a 19th century labor organization. Both of those groups tried to build black-white coalitions. And the threat that such a coalition could be constructed was really the thing that triggered the big backlash in the 1890s that produces segregation and disfranchisement. Plessy versus Ferguson okays segregation in 1896. Williams versus Mississippi in 1898 okays disenfranchisement by the use of poll taxes and other methods. And what was being feared then was as much this political and economic power of blacks and whites together as anything else. In the early 20th century, the first non-Christian minority group of significant size in this country, American Jews, found themselves equally the source of this kind of fear of both workplace organization and political influence and supposedly a dangerous religious presence. After the 1905 abortive revolution in Russia, many Jews came to the United States. A lot of them helped build the unions that became important in doing away with sweatshops. People like Sidney Hillman, a rabbinical student in Russia who came to the US and built the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. The very same year that the abortive Russian Revolution took place, there was an effort to found the first big industrial union in the United States, the Industrial Workers of the World. And there was great fear that this new immigrant group, these radical Jews from Eastern Europe, were going to make a Sovietized America. And America went through a kind of prolonged Red Scare that resulted in deportations in 1919 and in legislation called anti-syndicalist laws that made it a crime to even advocate some kinds of mass organization and strikes. So repeatedly in American history, we've seen that when new minority groups in the United States have bid for power, either in the voting booth or in the workplace, that they've been demonized, and that efforts to separate them out have resulted from efforts to bring change. It's not just the fear of demographic change then that Bill O'Reilly is really talking about. It's the fear of people coming together and taking some amount of power that they didn't used to have. There are plenty of people in white America who are perfectly comfortable with having many more minorities in this country as long as they don't have power and a voice. But it's around that question of will they be able to have a voice in shaping this nation as African Americans bid to have in the 1880s and 90s, and then again in the Civil Rights Movement, as the Irish Catholics did in the 19th century, as Jews did in the early 20th century. That's the key question, I think, to be faced. And we do need to come together to assert, as people did before, that the things that unite us are more important than the things that divide us, and that by defending each other's rights, we're all enhanced. The great motto of the Knights of Labor in the 19th century is one I'm sure you've heard different versions of. They were the one who popularized it. An injury to one is the concern of all. And that's essentially what I get as the theme of this report, and I'm very grateful for it. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. I echo the thanks of my colleagues up here. Thank you to ISPU and the Alwaleed Bin Talal Center for hosting and for the invitation to join you all in this conversation today. I think we've recognized some of the important things that are coming out of this research and the reports that are launched today. But I want to also recognize and thank the research team for just acknowledging that data is important, particularly in the context of the American Muslim community and the challenges that we're facing. A lot of the work that we do, Muslim advocates, I'll briefly tell you about that in a second, but you know, the data is what we need to help inform others about the challenges that we're facing and to draw the connection. So, so thank you for that as well. Talking about how it relates to the work that we do. Muslim Advocates is a national legal advocacy organization, and my role at the organization is to head the program that focuses on countering anti-Muslim hate. Part of that is looking at the trends in American society, whether it is with respect to anti-foreign law bans or anti-Sharia legislation, or things like hate crimes and the trends in hate crime statistics that we see targeting American Muslims as well as other communities of faith. But how this relates to our work is it helps, like I said, to inform our ability to talk to lawmakers, policymakers, our allies about the challenges that we are facing and the challenges that we sort of are hoping to overcome in the near and distant future. So I think, you know, qualitative and quantitative data are critical to that advocacy for a couple of reasons. First, I think it really helps to define the problem so that when we're talking to a group of allies, to our colleagues, we can say, look, this is what's been happening for the last 2 years, 3 years. We know from 2011 to 2013, this is what happened, and hopefully it'll be a platform on which we can build and add more data, more research, a foundation that we need to kind of move forward when we're talking about what strategies we should employ, how to guide our objectives and our goals, based on the actual foundation that we have, these numbers and the statistics. And I think that a lot of what we've done is based on anecdotal information, which is not bad. I think it helps to personalize and humanize an issue. We know that there are stories of individuals that really, really help to kind of amplify the problem, but without the data to support those stories, to support that anecdotal information, we're often kind of, we just need that additional push to kind of get people to buy into the need to kind of react and to do something in response. So I think the data that we see in this report, in addition to hopefully information that's going to come out of it, will help to bolster everything that we've been doing thus far. Secondly, I think that the data can accurately help us strategize and guide where we're going from here. We don't know where to go until we know what the problem is. So when we talk about things anecdotally, it's really, really important. It helps to share common ground. It helps for people to recognize the challenges in terms of what I'm facing and what another person is facing. But when we have the empirical data, the evidence to show for it, then I think we can more efficiently talk about what we should have as goals for 2015, for the next decade, for the next century. I think that's what's really important for us in our work to kind of take from this report. I wanted to share an example of how I think that the data can help inform what we do in the context of hate crime statistics. Over the last few years, particularly looking at 2010 and 11, and since then, there's been a noted increase in annual statistics reported by the FBI, which focus on anti-Islamic incidents. The FBI collects this data annually. However, it's not mandatorily reported by states. So there is pretty much an understanding that the data that we have and that's reported annually by the FBI is an underestimation of what's really happening out there. In addition to that, up until a year ago, the FBI had no intention of collecting data on particular groups that are of key importance to this information. So for example, they did not collect data on Sikh Americans. They did not collect data on Hindu Americans or Arab Americans. All of those were often lumped in with anti-Islamic incidents. And the challenge with that is we don't have accurate information. The Sikh community does not have accurate information to further their goals and objectives. The Arab American community does not have accurate data, and the Hindu American community also. But those are just three subsets of the community. There are other categories that have now since been added and will hopefully be implemented in 2015, which can then ideally transform the data that we receive and make it more robust and increase the accuracy in which we're reporting this information or getting this information and sharing it. So I think that's an example of how data can really, really transform the way we do the work that we're all doing. And I think a couple of other things that I take away from this report and from these reports are the historical context in which the framework of the historical context is really important because it, like my colleague said, it basically establishes that we're not alone, that there have been others that have experienced this type of bigotry and these challenges, and we can take from them lessons that they learned from the work that they did. We can build on their successes, and we can also learn from anything that didn't work, and ideally move into a structure and a formation in which we'll be more successful. I think that the notion that today American Muslims are targeted by bigotry it's true, but there's also this idea that yesterday it was a different community and tomorrow it will be yet another. So if we stick together and we recognize the common ground and the common challenges that we've all experienced and we're experiencing today, I think it just makes us that much stronger when we're out there and we're talking about what we can do to improve our structures within organizations and within coalitions and collaborative work that we do. I also want to say that I think the industry of hate that is out there, particularly the anti-Muslim hate network, it's very large, and the anti-Sharia, anti-foreign law bills that we see are just one facet of that. I mentioned hate crimes. There's also mosque opposition. There's also, that comes in the form of local legislative action. There's also hate groups and anti-Muslim hate proponents that are extremely, extremely vocal and active within their local and national networks, and they've also taken that to the internet. And there is a huge population of people on the internet, and they have a significant following online where they're able to kind of spread this anti-Muslim sentiment and continue to build on that. And the internet has proven time and time again to be a platform where people can mobilize very quickly the followers that they have and gain new supporters. Within seconds, within minutes, they can send out a message. And I think that I hope that this is just the beginning and that we're all inspired to do more research and to kind of build on this idea that empirical data and evidence is what we need to make our efforts more worthwhile and stronger. Part of that is the use of the word Islamophobia, and many mainstream sort of media outlets use the word Islamophobia, and I think within advocacy circles that word is used as well. At Muslim Advocates, we use anti-Muslim hate or bigotry because for a couple of reasons. First, because the word phobia implies that people have a fear. And you can look to other organizations that have done research on the anti-Muslim hate network and this industry and all the money that's put behind it, and they're actually not fearful of Muslims. They hate people. They're bigots. And the idea that it's okay if you're fearful of someone because you have a true fear. I'm afraid of spiders. So it's okay, she's afraid of spiders because she's just afraid of spiders. It's very different from someone who has a deliberate agenda to target a particular community and to gather supporters and galvanize a group of people to target that community. So, you know, we use that type of language because we think that it's more powerful, and to call someone a bigot is much more offensive than to say that someone is just fearful. So, you know, we hope that people will continue to do more research about that and the way that people are, it's true that I think there are people in America that are fearful of the other, that are fearful of people that they've never met or that they don't know, and what they see on TV is frightening, perhaps. But I think that there's also this important facet of the anti-Muslim network that is really hateful, and they're very deliberate about what they do. So I'll just end with this hope that we continue to do more research. I think it's really, really important, and I hope that we can all think of ways and strategize different facets of the work that we do that we want to see more empirical evidence on so that we can keep moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating discussion. I think it was really important to first understand the overlap, the concrete overlap with other communities, specifically the right to vote and the legislation around expanding that right, the historical context, as well as a very good reminder around the way that the narrative, the rhetoric that we use to describe this problem. I want to start and give you the first question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead and line up at either one of these microphones. My question to all three of you is this. We just had a midterm election where we saw a real shift toward the right. We also know that this issue is a minority problem within the Republican Party. So ultimately, part of the strategy, part of the solution lies within the Republican Party. What is your recommendation for outreach to the center-right, who may not necessarily agree with this kind of legislation, because it is, as we've seen, a minority of the legislators in that party? How do we reach people that may not agree with us on every point?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm going to kind of take a step back and talk about next steps. I mean, I'm going to get there, so just hang in there for a sec. And it's nice to be able to kind of dovetail off of what my colleague was saying about this hatred piece, because we'd like to talk a little bit more about implicit bias and unconscious bias, which is another piece of this, and it is affecting quite a large part of the electorate. So not necessarily the people who are explicitly, that have animus, that hate, that have explicit bias, but really, those folks who, and like most, Americans, consciously believe that we're equals, that we want to live in an egalitarian society, and yet those unconscious, immediate kind of those associations that you make without even thinking about it, those are actually far more predictive of our behaviors. So this is particularly dangerous for decision making and for policy making, because it's possible for people to really not be lying when they claim that they're not racist or they're not prejudiced, while at the same time advocating for policies that are especially destructive to groups that don't look like them. So the good news is that the emerging science data tells us that we can replace negative stereotypes with neutral ones or positive ones, and we can actually increase our empathy for other folks, for other groups. The Perception Institute is a consortium that uses these mind sciences to develop strategies that reduce racial bias and anxiety, that racial threat that you were talking about earlier. And so they advise us that our messaging really has to consist of narratives that lead to that empathy, right, and linked fate. So how do we do that? And this gets to your point. Media. There is a dearth. There's a dearth of Muslims in the public space, and we have to increase those numbers. And there needs to be diverse Muslims in the public space so that they're not seen as a monolith. They have to be more visible and claiming that narrative in a proactive way, so that it's not like you're being forced to be on the defensive and then boxed in these, in those few moments where you're invited to talk about, some national security issue, right, on the defensive. And really, it's all minorities, including Muslims. We really need to be careful when we are on TV and radio that we're not distancing ourselves from other stigmatized minority groups, and that we're not allowing casualties of war, so to speak. We have to be using inclusive language and not reinforcing ultra-conservative messages or framing. We have to pipeline more Muslims into leadership programs and national networks where they have deep media training, and where you can, exposing them to more visibility nationally. And then make sure that we have Muslims, experts in various fields, right? So again, we're not going back to those same few tracks of national security, and then we are unconsciously sort of associating Muslims with these really narrow topics. So, I mean, you obviously want to be in that space, but not limited to that space. The second piece, the media was the first piece, transformational coalition building is the second piece, and this is how we're going to build power here. And this goes beyond as Professor Manuel Pastor out of University of Southern California is a demographer, and he talks about transactional coalition building. It's kind of a lower level where you're just coming in and do, tit for tat. I'll do this project with you, you do this project with me, coming together occasionally to link up and do something, but really taking it to the next level and doing transformational coalition building, where you feel what each other feel and you defend one another as a matter of practice. And that can only come about as seeing your stakes and fates as one. And a little bit later in Q&A, I'll probably have time to go into an example of this. We've been doing this with the Native American, Asian, Hispanic national caucuses. But that transformational coalition building is going to be critical. And then the final piece is really increasing legislative and political power. Andre Carson is great. Keith Ellison is great. We need more Muslims in elected office at every level, at the county level, at the local level, on the school boards, in the state legislatures, and in Congress. And we need them to be running campaigns, and we need them to be serving as legislative staff, and we need them to be forming PACs and donor committees, and really educating candidates, elected officials, and then holding them accountable. So I think when that comprehensive piece, the messaging, in really controlling the narrative, in the public sphere, the coalition building so that it's not just you fighting, other people are fighting with and for you and in your absence, right? And then literally that political power that comes about from being at the table, and I tell you, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. As a wise man once told me, being at that table and making those decisions, as an elected official, the staffs for the Republican legislators as well, and running their campaigns and writing their talking points, and putting issues before them that they are reading. Those are all of the ways that we can really build deep political power, and then once in office, then forming those caucuses.
Yeah, I think those are all really great ideas and very important for us to think about. I think I would add, you mentioned for coalition sort of fighting for issues in our absence. I think that's really key, because just as much as we need to build the coalitions, and we should all be part of the coalitions, we should be at the table for issues that are not only affecting the American Muslim community, but also affecting the other communities as well, not just sort of selective involvement, where if it's affecting the American Muslim community, then they're at the table, but if it's not affecting the American Muslim community, then we don't participate. And I think part of that, there has to be an educational component where there is an understanding of how issues affecting the immigrant community also affect the American Muslim community. Why? Where's the connection? How do they connect? And what are the implications of, like in one of the reports, talking about how the Blaine amendments from decades ago are now being used to affect communities all across the board. That's not something that a lot of people will know about. So to be able to draw the connections and make the links so that we see why it's important, I think that also applies to the center-right legislators and people in office, where they may be supportive of one particular issue, but they haven't come out and said anything either in favor of or against American Muslims. So maybe educating them about how an issue affecting the immigration issues or immigrant communities or voter ID laws, how does that relate to the American Muslim community and the challenges that they face. So drawing those connections. And I think also I would just echo the idea of controlling the narrative. That I think is really, really important. And for those people that are not proposing the bills or sponsoring the bills, they might be more open to our narrative. So to be able to push that narrative to those that are willing to listen.
Take questions. Please line up at the microphone and state your name and your affiliation.
My name is Ahmed Solomon, a consultant. And the media is a major contributor to Islamophobia, as was said by the panel. And for two reasons. One reason is that there is a kind of like Bill Maher programs where he had his panel that was didn't have anybody who represents Islam, for instance. And if it wasn't for Ben Affleck trying to defend the issue, then it wouldn't have happened. And the second component is that the media does for a long time ignore the moderate voices of like imams or prominent Muslims. So how can we promote or convince anchors, for instance, that when they are discussing Islam, they should have somebody who is from the Islamic community that could defend or at least say something against the reasons that are given by the others. And at the same time, on the other side, how can we promote in newspapers or magazines more articles that promotes tolerance towards Islam instead of Islamophobia? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple.
Michael Rhodes, and my affiliation, I'm a federal employee and activist and organizer the rest of the time. And this is so important to be here. And what I wanted to ask was, perhaps we should be thinking farther, like Dr. Martin Luther King did when he identified the three evils: rampant materialism, racism, and militarism, and how they're intertwined and work with each other. And I think he would say of Islamophobia, this is exactly what he was talking about. And I say this because we need to look beyond to our foreign policy. And when the President of the United States comes before the United Nations, the world, and America, and says that it's time for the world, especially Muslim communities, to explicitly, forcefully, and consistently reject the ideology of al-Qaeda and ISIL, and there's no reaction to that of outrage and hatred, because he's taking an ultra-conservative view, in my viewpoint. I was terribly outraged by this. I didn't plan on voting. I definitely didn't vote after that, because there's no difference between what he's saying. But I think this is a reflection of our imperialistic foreign policy, and it's just an excuse to get people motivated to support any darn war in the Middle East just to benefit our capitalist, military-industrial complex.
Okay. Thank you for your question. And we'll take one more, and then we'll turn to the panel.
So my name is Linda Sarsour. I'm the National Advocacy Director at the National Network for Arab American Communities. And my question, and I've been hearing about a lot of this, in the past year, and feeling like our community is getting into a better place talking about coalition building. But for everyone on the panel, for me, the struggle that I have both within the Muslim community and also outside the Muslim community amongst communities of color is that there's this thing called the table. Let's sit at the table, right? And then there's a lot of these tables nationally. They're in DC, they're on a state level. But I want to understand how we're going to move from that to the transformative coalition building that really happens on the ground in the communities, and the voices that are not at the quote tables, right? So how do we move from just saying our issues are related, our issues are connected? We have to work with each other. That's the only way we win. But in fact, on the ground, that's not exactly happening. The segregation is apparent across the country, even amongst the most marginalized of communities. So there's like marginalization within the marginalization. So I want to know how we take this high-level discussion about coalition building, which sounds wonderful, but in reality, it's not really happening the way it should be. So how do we move there?
Okay, great. Thank you for those three important questions. Turn to the panel. You can take all three of them. Anyone you'd like. Who would like to start? Madiha, go ahead.
Well, I'll start with the first question. I am not a media expert, so I'm just speaking from the experience of the work that we've done at Muslim Advocates, and I think we have to be very strategic about which media outlets we try to engage with. We've heard that Fox News is never really going to change their stance on certain issues, so it's probably best that we don't try to engage with them on an issue about whether it's something that a host said on a show or something that they said on, someone commented in an interview or whatever it was that there was an issue about. But there are some outlets that are more moderate, and perhaps those are the ones that we should be focusing our energy towards, engaging with them, identifying speakers that we want them to invite, identifying experts that we want them to invite to speak on panels when they're hosting a show or an interview. And I think that just being strategic is really important, because we do want to express outrage when someone makes a very bigoted comment, but we have to also target our energy towards an audience where we think we can make a difference. So that would just be my comment about how, I'm not sure, what the best way to do it is, but I think if we can identify and elevate the experts on the issues, hopefully there will be more traction within those moderate media outlets.
Okay, great. Two other questions. One having to do with the connection between domestic bigotry and militarism, and the second on how do we take this to the grassroots?
Is this one? Yeah. I actually would like to just kind of piggyback on the media question for a second. I'm also not a media strategist, and I think it's worth having one. I mean, I really do think that it is worth every dime to get an excellent media strategist and identify which groups, what kind of audiences are persuadable on some of your key priorities, and then what are the kinds of messages that resonate well with them, what stories, what kind of faces, being careful that you're still representing yourselves in your fullest expression, right? So not allowing the community to get boxed in with one leader or two leaders that get to speak on behalf of the whole community, but really offering the 3 and 4D of yourselves. And so, for a Fox News type of a scenario, if you can get some folks who can be focused and not get pulled into, O'Reilly and Hannity's game, nonsense, but can really think through that TV to that mom with 2 kids who's stirring pasta, and for some reason O'Reilly does something for her, and she's kind of like, oh, this guy has a nice face, what's he talking about? Kind of turns it up while she's cooking. You're gonna touch somebody that day. And those people are not necessarily going to be watching the more moderate outlets. So, you do have to be strategic about your resources and who you have on deck, and kind of how deep your bench is. But at the same time, sometimes the only way you're going to be able to access the voters that you need to get to are through some of these other outlets, and it's worth it to just pay the extra dollar to find out how to speak to those groups.
I'm going to try to see if I can actually run the table and hit all 3 of these questions. Okay, bear with me. Because I see a lot of overlap in that, to Mr. Suleiman's question and Mr. Rhodes. Your point is well taken regarding the media. The study itself was very focused on one facet of this issue, and that was looking at not just the legislative aspect, but even more directly at the state level. So we got out of, again, with all due respect, the Beltway, and looked at how things were being contested elsewhere, and how this affected not just Islamophobia, but again, how it was related to these other areas. Keeping in mind, again, this broader concern about what is happening to the country and how are people perceiving that change as we move toward, in the next 30 years, this watershed moment about the very identity of the country changing, and how that's a cause of anxiety for, it seems, so many, or at the very least it's being exploited in that way. And certainly the media is one of the outlets through which that perception or misperception, if you will, is being negotiated. So I think that the study can go ahead and have, and it's always our earnest hope that research then spawns more research, as Madiha said, and to then take a look at perhaps maybe the structure of the study. And instead of looking at these 6 issues through the lens of legislative action at the state level, perhaps looking at these 6 issues through the integration of the media debates about these issues. So that's something perhaps that if there's any potential donors and funders in the room that might want to take a look at that. And the other thing related to that, Mr. Rhodes, is your points about foreign policy are also very well taken. Again, because the focus of the report was on the state legislative level, that doesn't necessarily augur an approach to the foreign policy, because despite the fact that some of the state legislators masquerade as foreign policy experts, they themselves don't, they're disempowered in that area unless they aspire to higher office, and that may be a part of the conduit that is involved. But at the same time, I think it is beyond dispute that the foreign policy, and particularly how largely it looms in the consciousness of the body politic, adds to this issue of moral panic. And particularly when it comes to what is perceived as being America's recession from the world stage, and a presumption that America would always be at a particular level and depth, for better or for worse, and however that is justified. That then adds to this idea that is America now, for example, failing to lead? Is it afraid to lead? How will our friends think? What will our enemies think? That then feeds into this idea that if the pot is already being stirred in America demographically, how is that then going to affect how America sees itself ontologically? So I think that exists, but perhaps again, I would implore more research to be seen in maybe the correlation between foreign policy and a state legislative agenda. And then finally, Ms. Sarsour, your question about the table, we could be here until next year talking about this, because I think that you really you hit the core of one of the aspects of what was the goal of the project, is to raise an awareness among those who lack that self-awareness. There are some, as you well know, in the community, whether it's the Muslim community or in the broader community, to even say that there's an issue, that there is a problem, and certainly even fewer, and in an ironic way I say this, I hope that there's fewer, because it then bears relevance to our study, who see the integration and the connections across different issues and across different groups, to see how this is all related. Hopefully this provides 2 things. One is a mapping of the landscape, so that people can then have that awareness, and along with that the requisite education to move forward, to say that this is not just a mode of connection, but also a need of connection. So you have the node and the need. And along with that, the idea of, by placing a date out there of, say, 2043, and it's not an arbitrary date, it's something that's somewhat identifiable. It allows people to focus on both, as we've heard these words, and maybe in the short term, a transactional relationship across lines, to say, well, we've got to get the ball rolling, and there's going to be, for better or for worse, a perception of transactionalism and a quid pro quo. But hopefully from that, and perhaps in parallel to that, fostering the idea of transformational coalition building, that people see this not just from what one gains themselves for their own particular group, but recognizes beyond just a kind of dismissive empathy, that this is a very important idea. And particularly, and this is the third thing about the report that we're hoping, is that others can both add, subtract, and substitute different issues and different groups in using this as a matrix in looking at things either from the legislative agenda or, as I was describing too, even looking at it through media. So there's a lot of interchangeability in the model of looking at interconnectivity. To move to the next stage of saying that there are people in this room and there are people who are not in this room who don't realize that they may be next, that there may be another group that is completely oblivious to how the butterfly effect may reach them. Again, to borrow from a movie, the eye of Sauron is not going to completely be blinded, it's simply going to change direction and focus on someone else. And perhaps the critical need then for those who are in this room and who are demonstrating their investment with the project to start the ball rolling proverbially and create those kinds of coalition. And that hopefully will be one of the major areas of debate and conversation for both the Muslim community and other communities to then take this report as a template to move into strategizing about that.
Thank you, Saeed and Madiha and Joseph all commented differently about, in various ways about the coalition building piece, and so I just wanted to give an example. So we have been engaged in this 3-year project with the Black, well, obviously we're the Black Caucus, but with the Hispanic, the Native American, and the Asian caucuses of state legislators. And we're all very different sizes. A couple of the caucuses are maybe 25 to 30 legislators nationwide. Hispanic caucus is about 322, and we're 675. For this project, which was funded by the Kellogg Foundation, by the way, we met 3 times a year for 3 years and in different cities. And so the focus was really to understand the barriers of structural racism that keep children and their families in poverty, right? The barriers that are specific or unique to the different racial and ethnic groups and the things that we have in common and therefore would need common strategies to overcome. And so it really did take that much time to connect, to bond. Each legislative caucus contributed 10 legislators, so we were equal in that sense. Despite the varying numbers of the overall caucuses, we all came together in equal parts. And then, in addition to getting to know one another through these various meetings, we would actually go out into the community so we could see problems in context and solutions in context, and we would do site visits. So from New Orleans and going into the 9th Ward in the African American community and the Vietnamese American communities of New Orleans, to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where there are Pueblo Indians, to Minneapolis, going to a powwow with the Wachipi. This, Atlanta, Chicago, Hawaii, it was amazing to see the transformation with those legislators, because believe it or not, even though they wanted to be together, you would still at the beginning see a bunch of Black faces, a bunch of Hispanic faces, a bunch of Asian faces. And it took meetings for them to be all mixed in with one another and to have genuine relationships and to then call on each other in the meantime before they would see each other at the next meeting. And so it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight, and you have to set it up in such a way to give yourself that time to build meaningful relationships. And part of building meaningful relationships means that you have to have the time to listen to each other's stories. It means that you have to let down those barriers and be vulnerable to one another, that you might have to shed some tears, that you might have to give up some power. And so you're literally practicing, in this safe space, and then modeling that and then taking that outside to exterior groups. So it's possible, it takes time. You do need to have some exercises, some one-on-one work, some small group work, where they're in 3s and 4s and 10s and all this kind of stuff over time, and that they're actually accomplishing goals together. And then that is something that can be then modeled for the greater community.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this afternoon. However, I think we've heard a lot that's going to keep us thinking and I hope talking. And we'd like to invite you to continue the conversation at our reception, which is starting right outside and we hope to continue to engage with you. Please visit our website and join our mailing list so that we can keep in touch. Thank you very much for coming.